This is going to be a hard story to hear, but it's necessary to tell. We have to tell the stories of those who lived and died in injustice. What happened to them cannot be lost and should not be lost to shame and kept quiet because it makes some feel uncomfortable. These are stories of real people who lived and died in a real time when the rule of law abandoned Black people. This story is full of pain and abuse and brutality and suffering. It's horrific if I'm being honest with you, but it's an important story that must be told. This story gives dignity to the Black people that Jim Crow stole everything from. Before I get into what happened to the Black people I'm going to tell you about, I need to give you some historical context first. This history helps to understand how this kind of violence and injustice could take place, and no one thought twice about it. So give me a few moments to explain this, and then I'll get into what happened. Before the Civil War, lynching of Black people rarely occurred, because to lynch an enslaved Black person meant that you were taking someone's property, and if they lost their property, they lost their money. Lynching was reserved for whites, but as Black people moved into freedom and enfranchisement, lynching moved to be distinctly Black, a practice that was reserved exclusively for Black people. And one state in particular holds the honor for being the lynching capital of the country, and that is Mississippi. After emancipation, in Mississippi, lynching of Black people was commonplace. One historian said that it was characteristic of the society. On average, 2 to 3 Black men were lynched a day in the years after the Civil War in Mississippi. So many Black people were lynched in Mississippi that there are no real numbers to gauge just how many people died between emancipation and the year 1890. Entire Black families were wiped away during this period. It's as if they never existed. They were here one day and lynched the next. By 1962, at least 538 Black people were lynched in Mississippi alone. It was the highest number in the United States. And even though Georgia and Texas were close rivals, Mississippi was the worst. And it was the most embarrassing state to those in Congress who opposed passing federal anti-lynching legislation. Mississippi ranked first in all categories. First in the most lynchings, first with the most multiple lynchings, the most per capita, the most female victims, the most victims taken from police custody, the most lynchings without arrest or conviction of mob leaders, and the most public support for mob lynching. From 1882 to 1945, Mississippi had 42 double, 8 triple, 6 quadruple, and 3 quintuple lynchings, and it had some of the most brutal forms. Black people were executed by blowtorch and tortured to death with hot irons and drowned and bludgeoned and dragged behind cars. At least 15 Black people died in public burnings. They would call them Negro barbecue. Another characteristic of Mississippi lynching is that no one was ever held accountable. Jim Crow mobs faced no opposition to inflicting injustice on Black people. Whites who lynched Black people were described by a Mississippi newspaper as being like the offspring of royalty. They were untouchable and not subject to public scrutiny or the law. They did as they felt and pleased to Black people. This is the environment that Black people lived in the Jim Crow South in the state of Mississippi. Every day could be a day where you could be lynched. That brings me to what happened in Shubuta, Mississippi in 1918. Before I tell you what happened, I have to tell you about the people involved. Give me a few moments to tell you about each of them. It's important that I tell you who they are and where they come from so that their humanity is recognized apart from the brutality they face simply because they were Black. Major Clark was born in February of 1897. His brother Andrew Clark was born around 1903. Both were born in Clark County, Mississippi, to Eddie Clark Sr. and Charity Clark. Eddie and Charity were both born before emancipation, so it's likely that they were once enslaved. Major and Andrew were 2 of 11 children. The Clark family worked as farmers, and by 1910, the family managed to own their own home and farm in Enterprise, also located in Clark County. The next family I want to tell you about is the Howze family. Maggie Howze was born in 1894. Her sister Alma was born in 1901. Both were born in Clark County to Elias and Amanda Howze. There were 2 of 6 children. Their parents were born before emancipation, so it's also possible that they, like Major and Andrew's parents, also experienced enslavement. The Howze family worked as sharecroppers and rented land like other Black people in that area. There's a third family involved in this story, and that's the Johnston family. Dr. Everett Johnston was born into a very old and prominent family in Shubuta. His father, Arista Johnston, managed to bring the family back to success despite the end of slavery and the loss of their wealth. By 1918, the Johnston family owned and farmed over 1,000 acres of land in Mississippi. Arista was even elected to represent the people of Shubuta in the Mississippi legislature in 1899. He served there for 3 terms. He will also serve as Shubuta's mayor and as a county supervisor. Because of the wealth and the status that they had, Harrison Johnson expected his sons to carry on the family name and pedigree. But Everett couldn't live up to the name. Everett and his two younger brothers all went to dental school in Atlanta. After graduating, Everett opened a dental practice in Mobile, Alabama. In 1905, he married a woman named Emma Sullivan, and soon after they began having children and raising their family in Mobile. Things should have been great for Everett from here, but they weren't. Everett had a serious drinking problem, and it began to cause problems for his life and his dental practice. It got so bad that in 1918, Everett's brother Ernest had to come to Mobile to save his brother's dental practice, but it didn't work. Everett ended up moving back to Shubuta. Everett went back to the family business of farming. This is his 1918 draft card. You see here that he lists his occupation as a farmer. His drinking and all the bad habits that flowed from it ended what should have been a promising career. But even though his dental career was over, it did not stop Everett from doing all the things that put him in this position. In fact, he continued his self-destructive behavior. Rumors began to spread around Shubuta that Everett was having affairs with black and white women, many of whom were married. White and black men set their sights on Everett for revenge. It was his inability to control himself that led to a horrific incident of racial mob violence that caused so much pain and injustice for the Clark and Howze family. Sometime in early 1918, when Everett was about 45 years old, he invited 24-year-old Maggie Howze and her sister, 16-year-old Alma, to come and live and work on his father's farm. We don't know the exact circumstances surrounding what they were going to do. We don't know if it was to share crop or to do domestic work, but what we do know is that Everett's goal was to get access to Maggie and Alma. Later in 1918, 20-year-old Major and his brother, 15-year-old Andrew, also moved onto the Johnson farm. They were there to pay off a debt that their father owed. Eddie Clark hired out his two sons to pay off a debt he had for a mule that the family purchased. It was on the Johnson's farm that the two young men met Alma and Maggie Howze. The Clark brothers and the Howze sisters got to know one another, and it wasn't long before Maggie and Major began to have feelings for each other. The two decided that they wanted to make it official and marry, but there was one problem: Everett Johnston. When Everett found out that Maggie and Major were going to marry, he became enraged and went to confront Major. He told Major to leave Maggie alone. His anger had nothing to do with the possibility of losing a worker. It was far more sinister than that. Maggie was pregnant with Everett's child, and so was her younger sister, 16-year-old Alma. Everett had gotten both of them pregnant, and he was determined to keep them for himself. The philandering, disgraced former dentist had abused these two young girls and was fighting to ensure that he can continue that abuse, and Major Clark stood in Everett's way. On December 10, 1918, Everett was in his barn milking a cow when he was struck by fire from behind. He would later die from his wounds. Suspicion immediately fell on Major Clark. The story that people were spreading was that Major took out Everett so that he could have Maggie to himself, but there was no evidence to support this. In fact, the evidence supported the opposite. After Everett died, Major did not flee. He remained on the Johnson farm. He had not done anything wrong and didn't think he had anything to run from, but none of that mattered because Major was soon arrested. Even though blame had been placed on Major, there was still no confession, so officials decided to make sure they had one before his first court appearance. Major was taken to a jail in Meridian, about 40 miles away from Shubuta. Once there, Major was stripped naked. He was then made to sit on top of a vise. The white men then crammed Major's testicles into the vise, between its metal jaws. The men then tightened it. Major screamed out in agonizing pain. They wanted him to confess to intentionally firing at Johnston. When he wouldn't confess, they tightened it more. The pain was too much for Major, and he could not take it any longer. He gave them the confession they wanted to hear. He said that he and his brother, along with the Howze sisters, plotted to take out Everett. He told the men that he waited in the barn and he hid, and he fired at Everett through a crack from behind. It didn't matter that what Major said wasn't true. All that mattered was that he confessed. The papers reported on Major's confession, but it did not give the details of the torture that was used to secure his false confession. After getting the confessions, the authorities had what they wanted, and also the mob had what it wanted. After Major confessed, his brother Andrew was quickly arrested, along with the Howze sisters. All four were kept at the county jail in Quitman, right outside of Shubuta. Each told the authorities that they had nothing to do with this, but it was too late. The injustice train had left the station and there was nothing they could do to stop it. And the plans for their lynching began almost immediately. After spending 9 days at jail, it was time for their first court appearance. On December 20th, 1918, the sheriff transported the Clark brothers and the Howze sisters to their preliminary hearing in Shubuta. Major had already been tortured into confessing, so when it came time to enter his plea in open court, he continued with his false confession. He didn't want to experience what had happened before with advice, so he pleaded guilty. He said that it was him and his brother Andrew, along with the Howze sisters, that agreed to take out Johnson, and that he was the one that fired the fatal shot. After that, that was all anyone needed to hear. After the hearing, instead of taking the four back to the jail in Quitman, the authorities took them to the tiny and less secure jail in Shubuta. They placed Sheriff's Deputy William Crane outside to stand guard. He was the only one at the jail to protect the brothers and the sisters. It was clear that the plan had already been put in place to come and seize the brothers and the sisters and lynch them. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, mob members poured into town, and all available rooms for rent in Shubuta quickly filled up, and cars from surrounding counties were all over the streets. They knew what they wanted, and that was the Clark brothers and the Howze sisters. It was clear what was about to happen. So many people came to town that the chief of police quickly left and went to Meridian. That night, the mob began to carry out their plan. First, they went to the town's power plant to cut the electrical supply. This sent the entire town into darkness. Soon after that, over a dozen cars arrived at the jail. Deputy Crane, who was assigned to guard the jail, quickly surrendered to the mob and gave them his keys and led them into the jail where the brothers and the sisters were locked in their cells. The four were seized and then thrown into awaiting cars and taken away to the town's steel frame bridge. This bridge was known as the Hanging Bridge in Shubuta, and it still is to this day. It's where many black people had met their end at the hands of a lynch mob. Once at the bridge, the pregnant girls and the brothers were dragged out of the cars. They were hysterical. They knew what was about to happen. The mob prepared 4 ropes for the lynchings. They secured one end of each rope to the underside of the bridge, and the other side of the rope were tied into nooses and put around the brothers and the sisters' necks. This must have been terrifying for them. I can't even begin to imagine the fear the 4 of them were experiencing in that moment. My mind struggles to comprehend exactly what they felt, because it's too much. These were 4 young people who knew they were about to die a horrific death for something that they did not do, and they knew no one was coming to save them. The brothers and the sisters pleaded for their lives. They told the mob they did not take Johnson's life and had nothing to do with it. They begged the mob not to lynch them. And for Alma and Maggie, they were pleading not only for their lives, but also for that of their unborn children. 16-year-old Alma was due to give birth in 2 weeks, and Maggie was about 5 months pregnant. But none of that mattered. They couldn't stop what was about to happen at the Hanging Bridge. 24-year-old Maggie pleaded for her life as the mob ready to lynch them. She sobbed and begged and said that they were innocent. But the mob did not care. In fact, it only angered them more. As Maggie pleaded for her life, a mob member took a monkey wrench and hit her in the mouth, smashing her teeth in. She continued begging for her life. He hit her a second time and put a huge gash on her head. As Maggie lay there, she watched her 16-year-old and 9-month pregnant sister, Alma, be thrown over the bridge with a noose around her neck. She then watched him do the same to her fiance, 20-year-old Major Clark, and his brother, 15-year-old Andrew. Then it was Maggie's turn. Maggie was picked up and thrown over the bridge with a noose around her neck. When the mob members threw Maggie over, she caught herself on the side of the bridge and began to pull herself back up over the railings. The mob didn't skip a beat. They threw her over a second time. She continued to fight for her life and that of her unborn baby, and caught herself again. Undeterred, the mob threw her over a third time, this time taking her life. They treated these 2 pregnant girls and these 2 brothers like they weren't even human. Their swinging lynched bodies were discovered the next morning. Clark County officials sent for black people to come and get the bodies, but no black person would do it. Black people stayed away from the Hanging Bridge. A group of white men had to come and cut the bodies down. The Howze sisters and the Clark brothers were taken from the bridge and put in the back of a mule wagon. As the wagon made its way through Shubuta, white crowds came to look at the brothers and the sisters as they were taken to Will Patton's funeral home. After the bodies were brought to Patton's funeral home, some witnesses said that they saw Alma's baby moving inside of her stomach. Patton wasn't just the funeral undertaker. He was rumored to be one of the mob members, and might have been the one who led the mob. He was also one of the people responsible for spreading the false story that justified the lynching of the 4. Because of this, when word was sent to the Clark family to retrieve their sons' bodies, their father, Eddie Clark, refused. He was told that a trap was being set for him in Shubuta if he came to get his sons' bodies for burial. Major and Andrew Clark were never given a proper funeral or burial. Neither were Maggie and Alma Howze. Patton buried them in 2 large holes, one for the brothers and one for the sisters. Injustice and racism stole their lives and robbed them of dignity and death. The next day, on December 21st, 1918, the coroner's jury said that unknown persons committed the lynchings. Now, This was a common result in the Jim Crow South. Everyone was involved in the brutality against black people, but no one knew their names when it came time for the investigation. After the quadruple lynching, everyone in Shubuta went back to normal. No one cared that 4 black people had lost their lives for no reason. Whites in town had a good Christmas, while blacks hid in terror. Some black people even fled the town. What the press said about the Shubuta lynchings and what actually occurred was vastly different. The story the press told was one of redemption and not of a crazed lynch mob. The official story was that overzealous and impassioned vigilantes had lynched 4 black people for taking the life of their white boss. This version took the heat and blame off of the good people and the town of Shubuta. They said nothing about Everett's activities with the sisters. And the reason the lynchers gave for why they had to act was that the next term for the criminal court was not until 3 months later in March of 1919, and that was too long to wait for justice. They said that the brothers and the sisters would have to be cared for and fed while they waited in jail, and that was too much for the mob to accept. They had to be dealt with immediately, so they carried out an economic lynching. When news of the brothers and the sisters lynching reached the NAACP headquarters in New York, the organization quickly sent a telegram to Mississippi Governor Theodore Bilbo, requesting information on what happened. At first, the governor ignored the NAACP, but when asked by a reporter if he intended to respond, Governor Bilbo said that his response to the organization was that he did not plan to investigate and that the NAACP can go to hell. The NAACP assigned Walter White to investigate the quadruple lynching. Even though he would later go on to lead the NAACP as an organization fought to change the lives of millions of black people, at this time, he was just a 26-year-old staffer. He read the reports that had come up from Mississippi. None laid out the truth. They all simply said that 4 victims had been lynched after they took the life of a wealthy landowner after one of the women had trouble with him. It was that word trouble that invited the intrigue to learn more about what happened. Because he could pass for a white man, Walter would often go undercover to investigate acts of mob violence. He did this many times throughout his career. He would pose as a newspaper reporter or as a businessman from the North looking to purchase land in the South to gain information on the lynching. This allowed him to become the leading authority on lynchings and mob violence at the time. He went on to write the NAACP's report, 30 Years of Lynching in the United States, and would often be called to testify about lynchings before committees. Walter White had a knack for digging deep into an incident of a lynching to uncover the details that Southern papers did not include in their reports. Southern papers typically framed the lynching from the viewpoint that a black person deserved what happened to them. Walter would speak to whites in the area and find out what really happened, and many times it was different from what was reported in the papers. He would get whites to talk about the lynchings in their area by acting indifferent or ignorant of what was going on in their town. He would also talk about how he had known of more exciting lynchings in other places. This would anger the Southerners in that area and make them tell him more details about what happened, almost as if to show that they held the title for the most exciting lynchings in the South. He used this technique to get lynchers in Tennessee that same year in 1918 to tell him how they had castrated a black man named Jim McElherron and chained him to a tree and doused him with coal oil and then roasted him alive in front of a crowd of 1,000 people. This was a very dangerous assignment for Walter White. The NAACP had launched a branch in Vicksburg in early 1918, but it had endured constant harassment and soon became inactive after whites ran most of the founding members out of town. For his investigation, if Walter was caught, he could have lost his life, so he had to be careful. Before Walter went south, he reached out to some of the NAACP's contacts below the Mason-Dixon line to get more information. Walter and the NAACP wanted to confirm their suspicions that the lynching had to do with the relationship that Everett was having with the Howze sisters. The organization had a black dentist in Mobile look into Everett's past when he practiced in that city. It also contacted Memphis businessman Robert Church Jr. to see what he can find out. Church was the son of the South's first black millionaire and ran his family's business. He hired a private investigator to look into Johnson's relationship with the Howze sisters. The NAACP wanted this information to not only get to the bottom of what happened, but also to help in their fight to stop lynching. The organization was just beginning its campaign to get a federal anti-lynching bill passed, and it was crucial that it had information and details on lynchings like this one to show why this legislation was so needed. When Walter White arrived in Shubuta, he tried his usual tricks of trying to get whites to boast about the lynching, but this did not work. The town was still on edge and seething from the events. White was able to talk to a local black preacher named T.H. Dobie and a woman named Hattie Howze, who was the Howze sister's cousin. It was Hattie Howze who told Walter White about how the 4 died on the bridge. Hattie said that the next day after the lynching, mob members were joking about how hard Maggie fought back that night on the bridge when she kept climbing back over. The black preacher, T.H. Dobie, he told White another piece of the story that changed everything. He said that Erica Johnson, Everett's father, said that he did not believe that Major Clark took his son's life. Erica said that he assumed that a white man was the real culprit. He explained that the white man knew of the tension between Everett and Major over the Howze sisters and used it as a cover to take Everett's life and blame the black men for it. This was a belief shared by many whites around Shubuta before the lynching. Erica told the mob members this and tried to stop the lynching, but they did not care. They planned to lynch the sisters and the brothers, and that's what they were going to do. After Walter White got these horrific details, he quickly left Shubuta and returned to New York so that he could publish the real story of what happened to the Clark brothers and the Howze sisters. Walter White wrote about what happened in Shubuta in the May 1919 issue of the NAACP's monthly magazine, The Crisis. He told the truth about what happened to the Clark brothers and the Howze sisters, and not the false narrative that blamed and justified their lynchings. Had it not been for the brave work of Walter White in putting his life on the line to investigate this, the truth about what happened in Shubuta would have never gotten out. When it came to inflicting injustice on black people, right or wrong did not matter. It did not matter if a community held a negative opinion of a white person that they claimed was harmed by a black person. He or she could be the worst person in the world in their eyes. Racial prejudice and hatred would overcome their shared disdain for the white person and refocus it on the black person. That was the hypocrisy of Jim Crow. Truth did not matter, only race. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard of the Clark brothers and the Howze sisters, and how did it make you feel learning all that they went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.